don't think we're making enough of the fact that Meghan Markle, there was a strategy meeting that the people sat around a table or they sat around a Zoom call, and they all agreed that Australia was the place to announce that Meghan Markle was an investor in an influencer app where you could shop her closet. And Meghan posed next to children in an outfit that were dying of cancer, anorexic teenagers. Meghan clutched members of the Bondi Beach victims. And within minutes, those outfits were available on this app. She's using these victims and children and ill children to sell her clothing for a commission. I mean, I look at that and I think that Queen Elizabeth is doing cartwheels in her tomb. Like, there is no way in hell she would have approved of something like that. She would have been disgusted by it. Yeah. You can't guarantee some of those children that they're pictured with will be here in a few years. Yeah. And there's Meghan using their presence to sell her wardrobe.
Something about this doesn't add up. A so-called tour that wasn't official, appearances that looked like charity but ended up revolving around money, influence, and branding. And now, more people are starting to ask the same question. What exactly was this Australia trip really about? Because when you start breaking it down, event by event, appearance by appearance, it starts to look less like a goodwill visit and more like a carefully structured operation built around visibility and monetization. And the backlash? It's not small. Reports suggest growing frustration, particularly in Britain, with the idea that royal connections are being used commercially in ways many feel cross a line. So in this video, we're going to walk through everything step by step. What happened, what's being claimed, and why this entire situation is getting so much attention right now. Let's start with the central issue, the Australia visit itself. Because even to surface level, people were confused. It wasn't a formal royal tour. It wasn't tied to an official state function. And yet, it carried the optics of one. There were visits to women's shelters, children's hospitals, public-facing appearances that looked, at least visually, like traditional royal duties. But critics argue that behind that image, something very different was happening. The claim being made is that this wasn't primarily about service. It was about exposure, positioning, and revenue generation. And that's where things start to escalate.
Commentator, good to have you with us, Ange. So it's all been community and charity engagement so far. Is this all just a veil as we turn to those paid events now? How's that going to be received?
Look, I think it's very much a case of front-ending the event with these typically royal-type events showing, that they're part of the community, that they care, that they have purpose. But, of course, where the spotlight's really going to turn is when they step up and speak at these paid events. There's tickets still for $500 for online to hear Harry speaking, but it's Meghan, I think, that could potentially get the criticism. $3,000, and she's only going to be on that stage for a very short time because, of course, she's going to the rugby afterwards. So there's a very small time. Then, of course, you leave people to spend a weekend where she's already gone.
Yeah, that's that paid hotel retreat in Sydney, of course, coming up this weekend.
One of the most talked about moments was the Sydney event, a high-priced, women-only gathering. Tickets reportedly costing around £1,700, roughly $3,000 per person, hundreds of attendees. And the expectation? Access, time, an experience. But according to reports and commentary, Meghan's appearance lasted around 2 hours. Some sources suggest possibly even less, which raises a very direct question. Was the value delivered aligned with the price being charged? Now, defenders would argue, this is standard for high-profile appearances. Time is limited. Demand drives pricing. But critics are framing it differently. They're calling it overhyped, underdelivered, and built primarily on proximity to status. Before we go deeper, if you want more breakdowns like this where we actually analyze what's happening beneath the surface, not just repeat headlines, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Because most people are just reacting. Very few are actually breaking this down properly. And if you're trying to understand what's really going on in stories like this, That's exactly what this channel is built for. Now let's talk about the numbers, because this is where the narrative becomes more concrete. Reports claim Meghan earned around $250,000.
That's great.
Content of that speech, according to commentary,
Over the
heavily
shoulder.
personal, focused on therapy, growth, and personal struggles. Now again, supporters would say, that's authentic, that's meaningful. But critics argue, it comes across as disconnected, especially when delivered in high-paid settings. And this ties directly into a broader accusation that much of what's being presented publicly is being packaged and monetized at a premium level. Another recurring claim in the discussion is about effort. Specifically, that Meghan's professional direction leans toward influencing. High return, low-time investment opportunities. And Harry is often described as reactive, adapting to this model rather than leading it. Now again, these are interpretations, not confirmed facts, but they're being repeated consistently across commentary. And when repetition happens at this scale, it shapes perception.
For now 10 years, every day for 10 years, I have been bullied and attacked, and I was the most trolled person in the entire world, man or woman. And I'm still here.
Get over yourself. There's more. Here's the kind of wisdom Markle offered on mental health in the form of a quote she claims to look at every single day.
And a friend of mine gave me a little bag that had a quote on it that I put on. And I look at it every single day. And I would share it with you because sometimes I can imagine as you talk about depression or anxiety or the willingness or lack of appetite to even want to get out of bed or keep going, that this is the quote that it says, and I think it's important that you remember it, as I tried to as well.
Another flashpoint came from statements about public treatment. At one point, Meghan described herself as heavily targeted, bullied online. Now it's not being dismissed entirely, but critics pushed back by comparing this to broader public figures, serious real-world struggles. For example, or people dealing with financial hardship, health crises, or instability. And the argument being made is this. There's a disconnect between the scale of the platform and the framing of personal struggle. Now we get into the most serious and controversial part of the discussion, the clothing strategy. According to claims, outfits worn during appearances were quickly linked to online platforms, made available for purchase almost immediately. And more importantly, Meghan is reportedly connected financially through commissions or investment in the platform. Now, if true, this changes the entire context of those appearances because it suggests the setting isn't just symbolic, it becomes transactional. And this is where the criticism becomes much more intense. Hospitals, vulnerable individuals, emotionally sensitive environments. So critics are asking, is it appropriate to link humanitarian imagery with commercial outcomes? That's the central ethical question being raised. Another major point revolves around perceived contradiction. On one side, advocacy for protecting children online. On the other, public appearances involving children. Images widely distributed. Again, this is presented as a contradiction, not a proven violation. But perception matters. And this perception is driving a lot of the backlash. At this point, the narrative shifts from reaction to intention. Critics argue that none of this is accidental. Instead, they suggest coordinated planning, strategic positioning, deliberate monetization models. In simple terms, but structured execution. And that's what gives the story weight. Because if it's intentional, then it's not just controversial, it's calculated. Reports also point to polling in Britain suggesting strong disapproval, particularly around monetizing royal identity. Now, polling always has limitations, but the takeaway being emphasized is clear. There's a segment of the public that views this as crossing a line. So when you step back and look at everything together, you have a tour that looks unofficial but resembles official duties, high-priced appearances, monetization tied to visibility and a growing perception problem. And that combination is what's driving the conversation. Not one single event, but the pattern. If you found this breakdown useful, go ahead and like the video. Subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next analysis. Because stories like this don't exist in isolation. They evolve. And understanding the structure behind them is what actually gives you the full picture. Thanks for watching.